Today we're going to talk about the greatest baseball teams of all time. But this one is different than the other YouTube videos that you'll find on the subject. I'm not going to give you a top 25 list at all. Instead, we're going to talk about how to determine the best teams of all time, as well as some advice for greatest team projects with baseball sims. Okay, a lot of you are going to wonder why there's any sort of controversy over which teams are the greatest teams of all time. And actually, if you're of a certain age, you're going to wonder why anybody would think it's any team other than the 1927 Yankees. That's exactly what Bill James said in his new historical baseball abstract back in 2001. It's a waste of time, James said, because we all know it's the 1927 Yankees. Bill James then proceeded to spend considerable time talking about the greatest team discussion anyway. Yeah, I remember this book. I bought a copy of Bill James' new historical baseball abstract for about $50 when it was brand new back in 2001. I was in high school at the time, and I had already read the original historical baseball abstract, also by Bill James. I read it because my dad had a copy. I was really frustrated when I discovered that the new version was mostly the same as the old version. There are a lot of problems with that new historical baseball abstract, but we'll get to those in due course. James mentions in his first mention of the greatest teams problem that Rob Neyer and Eddie Epstein had just published a book on this exact subject. James then recommended that we look to that book for the answers. Then afterwards, Bill James proceeded to steal Neyer and Epstein's system to try to solve the problem himself. This is the same problem he told us we shouldn't waste our time solving. And of course, even in his own grasp, the 1927 Yankees did not wind up on top. Now, I strongly recommend the Neyer and Epstein book, Baseball Dynasties. It's outdated, but it is still well researched and very well written. It's also a lot better than James's book. In their book, Neyer and Epstein develop what they call an SD score, which is a tool to measure how much better a team was in any given season than the other teams in the league. A year and a half ago, I decided to follow that old Bill James tradition of stealing work. I revived the old system and called it instead the Domination Index. After all, that's a much more descriptive and interesting name than just SD score. Well, that leaves us with some questions, right? What does this SD score or Domination Index score actually mean? And is it really better than looking at the won-loss record of each team? Well, let's go look at the math a little bit first. Okay, this is what we call a normal distribution. Most values are located close to the average in the middle. There might be a few outliers, some much higher than the average, some lower, but those are few and far between. If we've got a normal distribution, we can look at what the standard deviation of data is within that distribution. The standard deviation tells us how dispersed the data is in relation to the mean. And as you can see here, 68% of all data points will be within one standard deviation of that mean, 95% within 2, and 97.7% within 3. So what does this have to do with baseball? Well, it turns out that runs scored and runs allowed for baseball teams in a league structure tend to follow a normal distribution. In other words, if you're going to look at every baseball league in the history of mankind and you're going to look at runs scored and runs allowed and how they're distributed, you'll notice that the more of these points you put on, the more it looks like a normal distribution. Since historically they follow a normal distribution, we can tell if a team is an outlier, i.e. if a team is like way better or way worse than other teams, by calculating how many standard deviations that team's runs scored and runs allowed totals are away from the mean. Okay, enough talking about this stuff in the abstract. Let's look at a real example. So here's the offense of the 1927 American League. As you can see, I stuck the runs scored totals for each team into a spreadsheet. On average, teams in 1927 scored 762 runs. The Yankees scored 976 that season. Okay, knowing that the Yankees scored 976 runs alone doesn't really tell us anything. I mean, there were teams that scored more runs than the 1927 Yankees. In fact, numerous teams have scored over 1,000 runs in a season. The important part here is how the 1927 Yankees measure up to their competition. In other words, we are trying to look at them in context, not just looking at their raw numbers. And that's why we're looking at standard deviation. And so I came up with this ugly spreadsheet formula to calculate that standard deviation. Note that we use the population version of the formula because we have the whole population. In other words, there were only 8 American League teams in 1927, and we happen to know exactly how many runs each of those teams scored. And then we do the same thing with the runs allowed. Notice that the standard deviation is different, though, of course, the average is the same. That standard deviation, by the way, doesn't really tell us much about the average run scoring environment. It's a measure of how far apart the teams are spread in their totals, and is not anything else. What we're looking for, in other words, is how much better than average the Yankees were offensively. We can then calculate how many standard deviations away from the mean each team's run scored total was by using this formula. Then we can do the same thing for runs allowed. And then we take those two numbers and we add them together. Okay, one more thing. You'll notice here that we're not looking at the absolute value of these numbers, which is what you would do if you were doing this in like a stats class. We're not looking at the absolute value because we're actually interested in what side of the curve the team is on. Because we're trying to figure out the best teams of all time, we're really only interested in positive numbers. The higher, the better. Or in other words, when you look at the graph, what we really care about is the right side of the graph. In the end, the Yankees were 3.65 standard deviations away from the other teams in the American League, which is an extremely impressive total. Okay, 3.65 is just a number. So to figure out what it means in context, we kind of need to get this number for every team in baseball history, and I've done that. Here are the top 10 teams in American League history sorted by this domination index. The 1927 Yankees are number 3 on the all-time list. Notice that the teams on this list are generally the teams you would think of when you think of the top 10 American League teams of all time, with maybe a couple of surprises. By the way, that's the reason why this system works so well. You get a great mix of old and new teams. The teams that you expect to see are the teams that you end up seeing, and there are stuff like era adjustments, park factors, and the like that are automatically built in. Now, when it comes to interpreting these scores, keep this graph in mind. 95% of all teams will fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean. 2.5% will be more than 2 standard deviations away on the left, and 2.5% will be more than 2 standard deviations away on the right. In other words, when you've got a team with a domination index score of more than 2, you're dealing with one of the greatest teams of all time, and a score of 3 or higher is even more significant. Now, I keep an updated copy of this spreadsheet in the members area of my blog, so check out the link in the description if you haven't already. If you're a member, you download it, you can use it to your heart's content, you can mess around with it as much as you like. However, be warned that there are a few interesting surprises in store. For the National League, I only included teams from 1893 to the present, the modern history of the National League, since the rules were so much different before 1893. But when you look at this top 10 list, you'll notice the prominent placement of the 2022 Dodgers, the 2021 Dodgers, and the 2020 Dodgers. That's probably not what you expected. You know as well as I do that the Dodgers did win the World Series in 2020, though there's a question as to whether that abbreviated season belongs here. However, the 2022 Dodgers, the greatest team of all time by this measure, lost the NLDS to San Diego in 4 games. In fact, they lost 3 in a row. So were they really the greatest team of all time? It's hard to say this about a team that won 111 regular season games, but the Dodgers actually did underperform in 2022. Their runs scored and runs allowed totals indicate that they probably should have won a whopping 116 games. So what does this say about the 2022 San Diego Padres, who defeated the Dodgers so easily in the playoffs? I mean, should they be considered one of the best teams of all time as well? Yeah, I bring this up because this is one of the fundamental problems with this approach, and it really is a problem that a lot of people who talk about great teams ignore. The problem is whether the playoffs count. This problem goes back well over a century. In 1906, the Chicago Cubs, who rank as the number 2 National League team of all time by this measure, lost the World Series to the White Sox in 6 games. Believe it or not, the World Series that year was not as close as the scores would make you think. The White Sox dominated. The 1917 New York Giants wind up 3rd on the National League's domination index list. As you know, they lost to the Chicago White Sox in the World Series that year. In other words, if we leave out all the teams that lost in the postseason, we're going to wind up leaving out a lot of really good teams. And by the way, this is a problem that is nothing new. Okay, let's talk some APA. When J. Richard Seitz made his first Great Teams of the Past set back in 1951, he only included teams that won the World Series. However, in 1954, he decided to make cards for the 1922 St. Louis Browns. The Browns not only did not win the World Series, but they didn't even win the American League pennant. As you'll recall from my earlier video, the Browns hosted the Yankees in a key series in late September and lost by the slimmest of margins. In contrast, take a look at the 1987 Minnesota Twins, who barely finished over 500 and yet somehow won the World Series.
This one is gone. A 3-run home run for Danny Tartabull, and the Royals take a 7-4 lead.
The 1987 Twins had a Pythagorean won-loss percentage of under 500. In other words, they allowed more runs than they scored. In fact, in domination index terms, the 1987 Twins are one of the worst World Series winners of all time. They featured a negative domination index score. Okay, can you seriously say that the 1987 Twins belong in a greatest teams project, but not the 1922 Browns? Well, Strat-O-Matic apparently thinks that they belong, since they included the 1987 Twins in their Diamond Gems 1980 Series B set. On Deck Baseball also includes the 1987 Twins in their collection of greatest teams, and note that On Deck Baseball has not exactly printed hundreds of those teams. Now, I don't think that we can ignore what the Twins did in the postseason. I mean, it does count after all. The question instead is how we should weigh postseason performance against regular season performance. Note that the 1987 Twins lost their last 5 regular season games, every game after they clinched, in fact. Those games, of course, were not as important as the postseason games. Should we give them more weight just because they were in the regular season? Again, this is one of those questions that most people don't usually talk about. I think it's worth having this discussion. I don't think that we should only consider pennant winners among the greatest teams of all time. But then again, there is a difference between a team that dominated all season, like the 1998 Yankees, and a team that got hot at the end of the season, like the 2019 Nationals. And then come the 1902 Pittsburgh Pirates, who rank 4th on that National League Domination Index list. As you should know, there was no World Series in 1902, so we don't know how the Pirates would have done if there had been one. However, there are reasons to suspect that the 1902 Pirates were not one of the greatest teams of all time, and yeah, those reasons also matter a lot to this discussion. The truth is that the 1902 Pirates didn't exactly face the best competition in the world. The American League had siphoned off the best players from all the other National League teams. Now, you'll recall that John McGraw went to the Giants in mid-July, taking with him a number of Orioles players. This included at least 3 future Hall of Famers. However, this wasn't enough to challenge the Pirate juggernaut. But there's a problem here. I mean, sure, the Pirates were better than the rest of the National League, but the level of competition in 1902 wasn't really all that high. And this, by the way, is a problem that we don't really have a great solution to. In short, the method that we're using here kind of assumes that the level of competition has been about the same over time. There's no method for compensating for times when the rest of the league is unusually weak for whatever reason, like all the players were stolen. I recently made another spreadsheet featuring great teams of the past choices from a number of Major Baseball sims. Notice that the 1902 Pirates only made it to great teams collections from 3 companies. These would be APA, NP3, and Diamond Mine Baseball. The 1917 Giants did even worse. They were only recognized as a greatest team by Bill Staffa's NP3 game. Anyway, in other words, there is some controversy over which teams are the greatest of all time. And believe it or not, this doesn't stop here. For example, most baseball historians and pundits agree that the 1939 Yankees were the best team of all time. The 1940 Yankees featured a roster that was mostly unchanged from the season before, thanks in large part to the reserve clause, but the 1940 team only finished 3rd. Nair and Epstein compensated for this by looking at the top teams across multiple years. They called this a dynasty. And those Yankees made that list, even if you do include 1940. But there is a major problem here. This is a problem that should be obvious to you. Think of the roster of the 1986 Mets, for example. Now go look up the roster of the 1990 Mets, who did win 91 games. You'll discover that the 1990 Mets have a lineup that looks a lot different than the 1986 team, and you'll wonder why in the world you would lump the two teams in together. Now, one of the reasons why the great minds of baseball want to look at dynasties is to discount teams like the 1984 Tigers, who are usually dismissed as one-season wonders. But you know, this doesn't really feel all that right to me. So personally, I'm interested in looking at a team as a single entity over a single season, not over a collection of 4 or 5 seasons. I mean, a lot can happen over the course of just a single season. The longer you stretch out that time period, the more fuzzy the argument becomes. Now, as most of you guys already know, Greatest Teams projects are nothing new. Here's one that was printed in the APA Journal back in October 1968. Some people like sticking these teams against each other in tournaments, like this single elimination single game tournament from the February 1990 APA Journal. Others created more extensive tournaments with strict requirements to avoid playing with the same players over and over again. This short but sweet tournament in the September 1984 APA Journal has always been one of my favorites to read, in large part because the 1981 Expos of all teams wound up winning it. You'll notice that the person behind that last replay wanted to avoid boring games with teams featuring the same players. Now that's another big problem with these Greatest Teams projects, especially if you're putting together like a big massive league. George Foster was an important member of the 1975 Cincinnati Reds. They simply wouldn't be the same team without him. Foster also played on the 1986 Mets, though he was famously released a little over halfway into the season. Okay, there is no question that both the 1975 Cincinnati Reds and the 1986 New York Mets belong in the Greatest Teams discussion. But how do you avoid having George Foster play against George Foster? Well, one solution I've thought of is to carefully divide the Greatest Teams of all time into different smaller leagues, say like 8 teams each, and being careful when you create those leagues to avoid player duplication. Then you have the winner of each league play against each other in another league or structure or something. But of course that takes a lot of time. Roster sizes are another huge problem in these kinds of leagues. The 2022 Dodgers, for example, used 51 different players. In contrast, the 1905 New York Giants used only 21 players all season. But that includes the famous Moonlight Graham, who didn't record a single stat in his lone half-inning appearance. In fact, 4 of those 21 players appeared in fewer than 5 games, and relief pitcher Claude Elliott, despite the fact that he was with the team all season, was only used in blowout situations. So that means that the 1905 New York Giants in our project would have an effective roster of what, like 16 players? So how are they going to compete with the 2022 Dodgers and their 51 players? Now that's the sort of problem that you have to solve, and it really is hard to figure out. Well, in his musings, James wonders whether you could force a great team to go back to another time completely. For example, in this case, the 2022 Dodgers would only be able to bring 15 or 16 players back to 1905 with them to play the Giants. They would then be forced to play under dead ball era conditions. But again, this isn't going to work with modern eras. I mean, you can't just make up a bunch of middle relievers for the 1902 Pirates or whatever. Your best bet would be managing the players and teams by hand and fiddling around with the game engine when you have to. One more point before we finish this up. Bill James criticizes the domination index. He claims that it's not really all that different from won-loss records. That's actually not true. The 2015 Toronto Blue Jays, for example, wind up 7th on the all-time American League list using the domination index method, and that's a team that most people don't have on their all-time great lists. The 1983 Atlanta Braves are another very underrated team, ranking it at 46th on the National League list. This is despite finishing 3 games behind the Dodgers with only 88 wins. In other words, don't just dismiss the domination index offhand. I mean, it's not perfect, but it does tell us a lot more than you might think. Anyway, I'm going to start doing some deep dives into these teams, looking at them from every player's standpoint. Now that means that we're going to look at player usage, we're going to look at the times when players were active and inactive, and we're going to look at a whole bunch of other tidbits that are particularly helpful for people looking to do Greatest Teams projects. Anyway, there you have it. That's sort of a preview for what's going to come. We're going to take this one team at a time, and it is going to take a while. I've got a list of over 400 teams to cover, and I'm sure we're going to find more. So buckle up, this is going to be a fun ride.